The inventory record was wrong. Fleetarchivist Sesekvor noticed it the way one notices a stone in a boot, not immediately, not dramatically, but with a growing certainty that something was misaligned with the world. She had processed 9,000 confiscation manifests in her career. She knew what a warship inventory looked like. She knew the weight of the numbers, the pattern of tonnage declarations, the predictable geometry of a militarized species fleet composition. The humans had submitted 41 vessels. The manifest was immaculate, signatures notarized, tonnage verified by 3 independent Imperial survey drones, hull registration codes matched, every number confirmed by every other number. But Sesekvor had spent 6 hours staring at the document, and something in the architecture of those numbers felt like a room with no door. She filed the discrepancy as a Category 7 administrative anomaly, the lowest priority classification in the Imperial bureaucratic system, and moved on. She would think about that decision for the rest of her life. The confiscation had happened 18 standard days earlier, at a ceremony the Empire broadcast across 47 star systems. Grand Executor Mervsal had been chosen specifically for his height. The Imperial Communications Office had run the numbers. Species respond better to authority figures who project physical dominance, and Mervsal stood nearly 3 meters tall, his ceremonial plates polished to a mirror shine that cost more than most colony planets earned in a decade. He had descended the ramp of the Imperial flagship Absolute Prerogative with the measured confidence of a being who had never once, in 60 years of service, been surprised. The human delegation was waiting on the surface of Meridian Station, a neutral processing hub the Empire used specifically for these moments, because neutral ground had good light and good camera angles. Their lead negotiator was a woman named Commander Yara Solis. She was unremarkable in the way that the Empire's analysts had come to expect from human leadership: medium height, medium build, a face that expressed emotions at a frequency that made Imperial observers mildly uncomfortable, the way a screen flickering too fast strains the eye. She wore her dress uniform. She did not look afraid. Mervsal had read her file 3 times. According to Imperial intelligence, she was 43 years old, a decorated combat officer, veteran of the Kessler Corridor engagement, survivor of the Proxima Station siege. She had 3 children. She kept a small photograph in her left breast pocket, a ritual the analysts flagged as emotionally significant but tactically irrelevant. "Commander Solis," he had said, his translation implant rendering the greeting in flawless standard human English. "The Empire thanks you for your cooperation in this matter." She had looked up at him with an expression his behavioral analysts would later describe as unclassifiable not fear, not defiance, something that sat between them like a third presence in the room. "Of course," she said, "we're happy to help." The analysts had flagged that response as suspicious for 11 different reasons, and then buried the flag under 17 layers of bureaucratic review, because nothing about the actual confiscation suggested any cause for alarm. 41 warships, catalogued, boarded, secured, and escorted to Imperial holding at Velmor and Deep Dock within 6 standard days, every crew member removed, every weapon system powered down, every access code surrendered. The humans had been, in the words of Mervsal's official report, fully compliant. He had written those words with satisfaction. 3 mysteries lived in the space between fully compliant and what Sesekvor was looking at now. The first was the inventory anomaly, 41 ships catalogued against a pre-confiscation intelligence estimate of somewhere between 300 and 800 total human military vessels, depending on which analyst's projection model you trusted. The range itself was unusual. The Empire's intelligence apparatus could estimate a species' military strength to within 4%. The fact that human fleet numbers had a margin of error of nearly 500 vessels suggested one of three things. Either the intelligence was catastrophically wrong, or the humans had concealed their fleet so effectively that Imperial sensors couldn't locate it, or HFY stopped that third option before it finished forming. The second mystery was Commander Solis's final statement to the press pool assembled at Meridian Station, recorded and filed and immediately forgotten because it contained no militarily actionable information. A journalist had asked her how she felt about surrendering the fleet. She had paused for exactly 3 seconds. HFY had watched the recording 4 times and counted, and then said, with complete composure, "We kept what mattered." The statement had been interpreted by Imperial communications as an attempt to project false confidence for domestic human audiences. The psychological operations team had actually complimented it as effective face-saving rhetoric. The third mystery was the maintenance logs. HFY had pulled them because she was thorough, because thoroughness was the only thing she had ever been genuinely proud of, and because something in the geometry of 41 ships was still bothering her like that stone in the boot. The maintenance logs for all 41 confiscated vessels showed the same pattern: regular, meticulous upkeep, systems serviced on schedule, nothing deferred, nothing neglected. Except the propulsion cores. Every single ship had propulsion cores that were, according to the maintenance schedule, due for replacement asterisk. Not overdue, not failed, simply approaching end-of-service life in a way that the logs recorded with the same casual bureaucratic tone as a reminder to change an air filter. 41 ships. 41 aging propulsion cores. Every one of them surrendered right on schedule. HFY sat very still at her desk for a long moment. Then she pulled the full intelligence file on human shipbuilding capacity. The file was classified at a level 3 tiers above her clearance, which told her everything she needed to know about whether she was asking the right question. She submitted the access request through proper channels and received an automated denial in 40 seconds, which was actually faster than usual, which meant the system was paying attention. "Desk Secondary Lorvin," she said, not looking up from her screen. Her junior analyst appeared at her workstation with the slightly hunched posture of someone who had learned that enthusiasm in front of superiors was professionally dangerous. "Archivist. Pull me every civilian shipping registry the humans filed with the Trade Commission in the last 4 years. Every vessel, every tonnage declaration, every registered hull." Lorvin blinked. "That's the civilian registry. You want civilian shipping." "I want every ship they told us about," HFY said. "Not every ship they have, every ship they asterisk told us about. There's a difference." Lorvin left quickly, which was the correct response. The civilian registry took 6 hours to compile and arrived in HFY's queue at the 3rd hour of the night cycle, when the administrative wing of Imperial Fleet Command was empty, except for the cleaning drones and the 2 junior analysts who were too new to have learned that staying late was professionally dangerous. She opened the file. She started with tonnage. 3 hours later, she was standing in the corridor outside her office because sitting had stopped feeling like something her body was willing to do. The cleaning drone bumped against her leg twice before she noticed it. The humans had registered with the Imperial Trade Commission over the previous 4 years approximately 12,000 civilian cargo vessels. Tonnage declarations, hull registrations, all perfectly compliant with Imperial trade law. 12,000 vessels. The average human military vessel ran about 40% heavier than a civilian cargo ship of equivalent length. This was standard across spacefaring species. Military hulls carried armor, weapons, shielding, redundant systems. They were denser. They ran hot. They read differently on every Imperial sensor array. Except the human civilian registry, showed something HFY had never seen in 30 years of reading shipping manifests. The cargo vessels ran asterisk heavier than the military ships the humans had surrendered. Not a little heavier, significantly heavier. Some of them flagged as agricultural bulk haulers and deep space mineral extraction platforms, showed mass readings that put them in the same tonnage class as Imperial heavy cruisers. HFY stood in the empty corridor and thought about a species that had surrendered 41 warships with aging propulsion cores, right on schedule, while a woman named Commander Solis said, "We kept what mattered with 3 seconds of pause that the psychological operations team had called asterisk effective face-saving rhetoric." She thought about what a room looks like when it has no door. Then she thought about what a room looks like when the door is somewhere you weren't looking. She went back to her desk, pulled up a secure channel, and attempted to contact the Imperial Intelligence Directorate's duty officer. The channel connected in under 2 seconds. "We know," the duty officer said before she spoke a word. "Stand by for a classified briefing. Do not discuss this with your staff." The channel went quiet. HFY sat in her chair and waited and felt, for the first time in her professional life, the specific quality of fear that comes not from knowing something terrible, but from realizing that the people who were supposed to know terrible things already knew this one, and their voice had carried the particular flatness of people who did not yet know what to do about it. The classified briefing came 4 hours later, delivered by a senior intelligence assessor named Trojan, who had the look of someone who had stopped sleeping recently for professional rather than personal reasons. "What you've identified," Trojan said, pulling up a holographic display that filled HFY's office with red-flagged vessel signatures, "is not new. We've been tracking the mass discrepancy in human-civilian shipping for approximately 14 months. 14 months, HFY repeated. The analysis team's working conclusion is that human shipyards have been producing dual-use hulls for at least 6 years. Civilian superstructure, military-grade internal architecture. The hulls register clean on standard sensor sweeps because the weapon systems aren't installed during construction. We believe they're added later, at distributed locations we haven't fully mapped." HFY looked at the display. "How many ships are we talking about?" Trojan was quiet for a moment that lasted exactly long enough to become uncomfortable. "Our current best estimate," he said, "is between 4,000 and 11,000 military-capable vessels." The number sat in the room between them. "That's not an estimate," HFY said. "That's a guess with a margin of error of 7,000 ships." "Yes." "How?" Trojan pulled up a second display. "Because they don't keep them together. They're distributed across, according to our best current mapping, somewhere between 300 and 900 separate locations, most of them in civilian-registered facilities. A mining platform, a cargo-way station, an agricultural processing hub, each one holding between 8 and 40 vessels in various states of readiness. By the time we identify one location and dispatch a verification team, the ships have moved." HFY stared at the display. "They're nomadic." "The fleet is nomadic, yes." "This is," she started again. "This is intentional. This is a doctrine. They designed their military to be unconfiscatable." Trojan didn't answer. He pulled up a third display, and the expression on his face shifted into something that HFY would later identify as the specific look of someone who has been carrying information they can't quite make themselves say out loud. The third display showed a timeline. The humans had begun the dual-hull shipbuilding program, according to the timestamp embedded in the earliest construction records they'd managed to acquire, approximately 8 months before the Empire had issued its first formal ultimatum demanding fleet surrender. 8 months before. They anticipated the confiscation, HFY said. They planned for it. The silence in the room changed quality. Commander Solis knew, Vor said slowly. She stood there and surrendered 41 ships, and she knew exactly what she was giving us. The ships with the aging propulsion cores, Drevhan said. Yes. We believe the vessels surrendered were specifically selected, functional enough to pass inspection, outdated enough that losing them was operationally acceptable, and just impressive enough in number and variety to make the manifest feel complete. Vor thought about Mervsal and his polished ceremonial plates, and his official report with the words "fully compliant" written, in the satisfied hand of a man who had never been surprised. Grand Executor Mervsal's report, she said. Does he know? Drevhan's expression answered before he did. The Grand Executor is currently being briefed. How is he taking it? The intelligence assessor was quiet for a long moment. He asked, Drevhan finally said, whether we could determine what Commander Solis meant when she said we kept what mattered. Vor thought about a woman with a photograph in her left breast pocket, pausing for 3 seconds before answering a journalist's question. I think, Vor said carefully, that we've been asking the wrong question. What's the right question? She looked at the display, the red-flagged vessel signatures, the distributed locations, the timeline that started 8 months before the Empire's ultimatum. We've been asking where the rest of the fleet is, she said. We should have been asking why they surrendered at all. The answer to that question arrived 14 days later, without any warning, at a location the Empire had not considered strategically relevant. The Velmor Deep Dock, where the 41 confiscated human warships were being held under Imperial guard, was a facility that had processed 217 confiscated fleets in its 400-year operational history. It was staffed by 11,000 Imperial personnel, protected by 6 Imperial cruisers, and surrounded by enough sensor arrays to detect a shuttle launch from 3 systems away. The first indication that something was wrong was not a weapon. It was a sound. The dock's chief communications officer, a Keth-born bureaucrat named Orvis Lynn, heard it through his implant, a frequency outside standard communication bands, repeating in a pattern that the station's automated systems flagged as *unidentified signal, low priority, and then immediately unflagged when it began appearing on 17 separate frequencies simultaneously. What is that? Said Orvis Lynn, to no one in particular. His senior technician, Brevsom, was already pulling the analysis. It's a handshake protocol, but not Imperial standard. It's not any registered protocol. The station shook. Not the violent shuddering of weapons impact. A low, resonant vibration felt in the floor and the walls and the teeth that lasted approximately 4 seconds and then stopped completely. In Dock Bay 7, all 41 confiscated human warships powered on simultaneously. Every system, full power, propulsion cores igniting from cold in under 30 seconds, which was a technical impossibility for propulsion cores that the maintenance logs had flagged as approaching end-of-service life, which meant the maintenance logs had lied, which meant someone had written false maintenance logs into systems that Imperial inspection teams had certified as accurate, which meant Orvis Lynn's implant lit up with 17 simultaneous alerts. General quarters, he said, his voice absolutely flat with the calm of someone whose brain had not yet finished processing what his eyes were telling him. All hands, general quarters. The Imperial cruisers guarding Velmor moved to intercept positions. 6 heavy warships, each outmassing any individual human vessel in the dock by a factor of 3. The human ships did not attempt to leave. They powered up, and they stayed exactly where they were, engines running, and they waited. Why aren't they moving? Said the duty tactical officer, a young Merv clan officer named Severin who had graduated top of his class and had never once been in a combat engagement. They're powered up and armed, and they're just, why aren't they moving? No one answered him because no one knew. The station's long-range sensors chose that moment to begin reporting. "Contact," said the senior sensor operator in a voice that sounded like someone describing a natural disaster from inside it. "Multiple contacts, bearing all bearings." There, a pause that lasted 2 seconds. "Sir, I'm showing contacts on every approach vector." Severin looked at the display. "How many contacts?" The sensor operator looked up from her console. She had been doing this job for 9 years. She had processed sensor data from 6 military engagements. Her voice, when she answered, was completely steady, which was somehow more frightening than if it had shaken. "I've lost count," she said. HFY received the Velmoran report in her office on Centrale Station, 17 minutes after the first sensor contact. Faster than the standard military dispatch protocol should have allowed, which told her that someone in the chain of command had decided this information needed to move at a different speed than the bureaucracy was designed for. She read it once. Then she pulled up the recording of Commander Solis at Meridian Station. "We kept what mattered." 3 seconds of pause. She had been thinking about that pause for weeks, turning it over like a stone that wouldn't sit flat, and she thought she had finally understood what it contained. Not hesitation, not the calculation of a politician choosing words, something else. Something that she had seen occasionally in the files of combat veterans, a specific quality of stillness that occurs when a person knows exactly what is coming and has made peace with the distance between now and then. Commander Solis had known, standing on the surface of Meridian Station in her dress uniform, that she was handing the Empire 41 ships. She had also known what the Empire was walking into. The question, the one HFY had identified too late and too quietly to matter, was why. Why surrender anything? If you have a fleet of 4,000 to 11,000 vessels hidden across 300 to 900 distributed locations, why hand over 41 of them and smile and say, fully compliant? The answer assembled itself in HFY's mind with the horrible clarity of something that had always been there, waiting for the right angle of light. You hand them the 41 ships, because you need the 41 ships to be inside the dock when the signal goes out. Not as bargaining chips, not as a sacrifice, as a key. The handshake protocol that Orveslin Station had detected on 17 simultaneous frequencies. The signal that had activated the confiscated warship systems from cold in under 30 seconds hadn't come from outside the station. It had come from inside Dock Bay 7. The 41 ships had broadcast it. They had been sitting in Imperial custody for 18 days, fully compliant, powered down, weapons surrendered. And for 18 days they had been mapping every sensor array, every communication relay, every defensive system position, every patrol pattern of the 6 Imperial cruisers, and encoding that intelligence into a beacon signal that was now broadcasting on 17 simultaneous frequencies to every human vessel within range. The Empire hadn't confiscated a fleet. It had accepted a Trojan horse. 41 of them. The first human vessels arrived at Velmor 17 minutes after the beacon activated. They did not look like warships. This was the detail that Severin would include in his incident report, filed 6 days later, from a medical facility, with a hand that wasn't entirely steady. And it was the detail that the Imperial Strategic Analysis Office would spend the next 3 months unable to satisfactorily explain. The approaching vessels looked like cargo haulers, like mining platforms, like the kind of deep space infrastructure ships that the Trade Commission had been registering for 4 years with tonnage declarations that nobody had scrutinized closely enough. "Those aren't military vessels," Severin said, looking at the sensor display. "Those are civilian hulls." "Sir," said the senior sensor operator, whose voice had not regained any of its steadiness, "they're arming." Not armed, arming present tense, as he watched. The weapon systems were emerging from concealment positions integrated into the civilian superstructure. Cargo bay doors opening to reveal launch tubes. Sensor array housings rotating to reveal fire control systems. The agricultural bulk hauler that was 200,000 tons of registered mass and had just resolved on the close-range display with a weapons profile that matched an Imperial heavy cruiser. "How many?" said Severin. The number the sensor operator gave him didn't register correctly the first time. He asked her to repeat it. She did. He sat down, which was not a military posture, but his legs had made a unilateral decision. 612 vessels on the immediate approach vectors, more appearing on long-range sensors as the beacon continued broadcasting. The station's computer was updating the contact count every 40 seconds, and the number had not yet stopped climbing. Inside Dock Bay 7, the 41 confiscated warships were still waiting with their engines running. Orvislin's voice came through the command channel. "Sir, the dock bay doors." Severin looked at the interior feeds. The dock bay doors, sealed, magnetically locked, rated for 300 megatons of direct impact, were opening. Not being forced, not being cut or breached, opening, slowly and correctly from the inside, using access codes that the humans had supposedly surrendered 18 days ago. All of them had surrendered the same access codes, Severin realized. 41 ships, 41 sets of access codes, every code verified, every code certified. And somewhere in the cryptographic architecture of the Imperial dock system, those 41 access codes had done something that no single set of human credentials could do, authenticated a master override that required simultaneous authorization from a minimum of 37 independent registered vessels. The humans hadn't surrendered their access codes. They had surrendered the combination to a lock they had built inside the Empire's own system. "Weapons free?" asked the tactical console operator, a question directed at Severin with the particular urgency of someone who needs an answer before the situation makes the question irrelevant. Severin looked at 612 vessels, and counting, against 6 Imperial cruisers and a dock facility that was now helping the enemy exit its own bays. "Stand by," he said. "Sir." "Stand by." His voice was steady. He was proud of that later. "Get me a channel to the human fleet, any channel, whatever frequency they'll answer on." It took 45 seconds. The response came through clean and immediate, which meant they had been waiting for it. The voice that came through the channel was one he had heard before, in the broadcast recording from Meridian Station. "Commander Solis," he said. "Colonel Severin," she said. She knew his name. Of course she knew his name. "I'd like to discuss the terms of your facility's surrender." He stared at the display, 612 vessels. The count had just updated, 671. "You're going to tell me," he said slowly, "that you've had a plan for this since before we issued the confiscation order." "We've had a plan for this," Solis said, "since before you issued the ultimatum. The dual-hull shipbuilding program." A brief pause, 3 seconds, the same length as the pause at Meridian Station. "You found the civilian registry anomaly." "My fleet archivist did, 14 months ago." "But not the access code architecture." "No." "No," she agreed, and there was something in her voice that Severin would spend a long time afterward trying to name, not satisfaction, not triumph, but something quieter and more permanent. "That one we kept hidden a little longer." He looked at the dock bay doors, still opening. He looked at the propulsion signatures of the 41 ships forming up in orderly columns outside the facility, joining the fleet that was assembling around Velmor like weather forming. "The propulsion cores," he said. "The maintenance logs said they were failing." They were perfectly functional. The logs were written to match what an Imperial inspection team would expect to see in a fleet that someone had decided to give away. You gave us ships that looked expendable. We gave you ships that looked like everything you expected us to have, Solis said. That was the point. You expected us to have a small, outdated, undermaintained fleet. We gave you a small, outdated, undermaintained fleet. You expected full compliance. We were fully compliant. Everything you found confirmed everything you already believed. That's the hardest thing to resist, confirmation. Severin was quiet for a moment. Outside, the count had updated again, 704. The photograph, he said, and he wasn't entirely sure why he said it. In your left breast pocket, at Meridian Station. A pause different from the others. My daughter drew it, she's 9. She drew it. She wanted me to take something of hers with me. Solis's voice didn't change in any technical sense, but something in its texture shifted. She didn't know what I was walking into. I told her I was going to a meeting. You were walking into the most surveilled confiscation ceremony in Imperial history. Yes. Carrying a drawing by your 9-year-old daughter. I wasn't going to leave it behind, she said, and the quiet certainty in those words landed in the silence of the command bridge with more weight than the sensor readings of 700 warships. Colonel, I'm going to ask you one more time about the facility's surrender. I'd like to resolve this without casualties on either side. That's not a negotiating position. That's a preference. Severin looked around the bridge, at the sensor operator who had lost count, at the tactical console operator who was waiting for an order that hadn't come, at the 6 Imperial cruisers that were powerful and outnumbered and outmaneuvered in ways that had been engineered 18 months in advance by people who drew pictures of meetings and wrote false maintenance logs, and built cryptographic combination locks inside the Empire's own access systems. I need to contact Grand Executor Mervsal, he said. Of course, I'll hold. Mervsal's response came through Sesekvor's office 17 minutes after Severin's channel request, delivered in the flat, official tone of a communiqué that had been written by a committee in a very short amount of time by people who were feeling things they were not professionally permitted to express. The Empire was standing down the Velmoran garrison. Sesekvor read the communiqué twice, then sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling of her office, which had nothing useful to offer her. The Empire had, in the course of 36 hours, discovered that the humans had anticipated the confiscation and planned for it months in advance. The surrendered fleet had been a deliberate selection of acceptable losses. The civilian shipping registry contained somewhere between 4,000 and 11,000 military-capable vessels. The confiscated ships had spent 18 days mapping the garrison's defensive systems. The access codes had been engineered as a master override requiring 37 simultaneous authentications, and the fleet that had just assembled around Velmoran numbered, according to the latest sensor count, 817 vessels. 817. Against an intelligence estimate that had placed the entire human military at somewhere between 300 and 800 total vessels. Sesekvor pulled up the original intelligence file, the one classified 3 tiers above her clearance. She had been granted emergency access during the overnight briefing and hadn't thought to check whether it remained active. It did. She opened it. She read for 40 minutes. The human military buildup, according to the intelligence file, had begun not 6 years ago, as the dual-hull program had suggested, but 11 years ago. 11 years before the confiscation order. 13 years before the ultimatum that had supposedly prompted the confiscation. They had started building before there was anything to build against. Not in response to Imperial pressure, not as a reaction to the ultimatum, not even as a hedge against potential Imperial aggression. They had started building because someone, in some human decision-making body, 11 years ago, had looked at the political geometry of the galaxy and concluded that this moment, this exact moment, was mathematically inevitable. Vor sat very still. She thought about what it meant to build a fleet for 11 years in anticipation of a confrontation you couldn't yet see, to train crews for ships that didn't fully exist yet, to write the doctrine for a war you were hoping wouldn't happen but were preparing for as if it certainly would, to maintain that program through administrations and budget cycles and political pressure, and the 1,000 ordinary forces that cause long-term plans to collapse, and to maintain it with enough discipline and secrecy that the Empire's intelligence apparatus, which had correctly estimated the military strength of 214 other species, had missed it by a factor of 20. To keep 12,000 civilian hulls registered with the Trade Commission, each one a patient lie, each one waiting. To walk into the most surveilled confiscation ceremony in Imperial history, with a drawing by your 9-year-old daughter in your pocket, smile at the 3-meter Grand Executor with his polished ceremonial plates, and say we're happy to help Asterisk. Solis had known. Standing there on the surface of Meridian Station, she had known that 700 ships were waiting in distributed locations across known space. She had known that the 41 vessels she was surrendering would spend 18 days mapping Velmoran's defenses. She had known the access code architecture was already embedded in the dock system. She had known the exact length of the chain between that moment and this one, and she had stood at one end of it and handed the Empire the other end, and said fully compliant with a face that the behavioral analysts had called asterisk unclassifiable asterisk. Because it was. Because the correct classification for that expression was something the Empire's behavioral library didn't contain, a species-specific combination of absolute certainty, genuine risk, love for a daughter who drew pictures of meetings, and the particular composure of a person who has accepted that the plan will either work or it won't, and has decided to carry the drawing either way. Vor's secure channel chimed. It was Drevhan. He looked like he hadn't slept in 3 days, which was probably accurate. The Grand Executor is requesting a full analytical report, he said. Causal chain, how we missed it, every decision point. When? Yesterday. Vor thought for a moment. Tell me one thing first. The 817 ships at Velmoran, are those all of them? Drevhan's expression did something complex. Current assessment, he said carefully, is that the Velmoran fleet represents somewhere between 30 and 60% of total human military-capable vessels currently active. The number landed. 30 to 60%, Vor said. Yes. So there are potentially twice as many ships we still haven't seen. Potentially. She looked at the ceiling again. The ceiling still had nothing useful to offer. The report, she said. I'll start with the Category 7 anomaly I filed 18 days ago and work backward from there. Category 7, Drevhan repeated. You flagged this 18 days ago. I filed it as an administrative anomaly, lowest priority classification. He was quiet for a moment. What was the anomaly? The inventory felt wrong, Vor said. The geometry of the numbers. 41 ships against an estimate of 3 to 800. I looked at it for 6 hours and it felt like a room with no door. And you filed it as Category 7. I didn't know what else to call it. Drevhan was quiet for a long time. Include that in the report, he said finally. All of it. The Imperial Strategic Analysis Office would publish its official assessment of the Velmoran incident 14 months later, after the Treaty of Contested Sovereignty had been negotiated and signed, and the human fleet had stood down from Velmoran in the same orderly columns it had assembled in, leaving behind 41 warships that the dock facility returned without comment. The assessment ran to 900 pages. Its conclusion, stripped of the formal language and the bureaucratic scaffolding, and the careful passive constructions that allowed no individual to be clearly blamed for anything, was essentially this. The Empire had fundamentally misunderstood what it was looking at. Not the fleet, not the dual-hull program, not the access code architecture, not any single component of the human strategy. It had misunderstood the humans themselves. Every Imperial analysis of the species had proceeded from a foundational assumption that humanity, like every other species in the Imperial catalog, would optimize for self-preservation, that when faced with overwhelming force, they would calculate the cost of resistance against the cost of compliance, find compliance cheaper, and comply. This was not an unreasonable assumption. It had been correct 214 times. The humans had complied. They had been fully compliant. They had handed over 41 ships and smiled and called it cooperation. And simultaneously, not instead, not alternatively, but simultaneously, they had maintained an 11-year fleet program, distributed across 900 locations, crewed by people who had spent years training for a confrontation they hoped would never come. All of it predicated on the quiet and apparently unshakable conviction that surrender and preparation are not mutually exclusive asterisk. That was the thing the Empire's models couldn't process, not the ships, the conviction. A species that could smile at Grand Executor Merv Sol and his polished ceremonial plates, hand over 41 vessels with false maintenance logs and true access codes, and genuinely mean both the compliance and the contingency simultaneously. That was not a species making a tactical choice between two options. That was a species that had internalized something the Empire had no word for. HFY had tried to write it into her section of the report and deleted it 4 times before keeping it. She had finally described it as *A cognitive disposition toward parallel commitment, the ability to fully commit to surrender and fully commit to resistance at the same time, without experiencing those positions as contradictory, because they were both expressions of the same underlying intention. We will not stop. We will comply with everything you demand, and we will not stop. She had pulled the recording of Commander Solis one final time while writing the report, watched it through once more, the 3-second pause. She understood it now. What Solis had been doing in those 3 seconds wasn't choosing words. She had been thinking about her daughter, about the photograph in her left breast pocket, about whether the plan would work and whether it would be enough, and whether she would be able to explain it afterward in terms that a 9-year-old could understand. Not we won or we defeated them. Those were outcomes, and outcomes were uncertain. Something simpler, something that had been true before the ceremony and was still true after it. We didn't stop. The galaxy had watched the Empire confiscate humanity's fleet and concluded the matter settled. The matter had never been the fleet. HFY closed the recording for the last time and filed her section of the report and sat in the quiet of her office and thought about a room with no door, and understood, finally, that she had been looking for the door in the wrong wall entirely. The door had always been on the other side. The humans had always known which side they were on. And they had been building, quietly, patiently, for 11 years, in the absolute certainty that when the moment came, the door would open, not because the Empire would unlock it, but because they had already put the key inside.